All right, perfect. Thank you for showing up, everyone. Welcome in. So our presentation is on confronting environmental racism, and we are UCSD Cross-Cultural Center. Before we begin, we're going to start off with a land acknowledgement. UCSD resides on unceded territory of the Kumeyaay Nation. The UCSD community holds great respect for the land and the Indigenous people that first resided where we are currently located. Furthermore, we want to acknowledge that the Kumeyaay people continue to have political sovereignty and cultural traditions as vital members of the San Diego community. We acknowledge and continue to amplify and uplift the Kumeyaay Nation for their contributions to the UCSD community and greater San Diego community. And this land acknowledgement is adopted from the UCSD Intertribal Resource Center. If y'all want to learn more about the Kumeyaay Nation, you can check out their website, kumeyaay.com. And if you are not currently on Kumeyaay lands and want to learn more about the lands that you are on, check out the link below at native-land.california.ca. This is an overview of what we're going to be going over in this presentation. So we're going to go over some key terms, and then we're going to learn a little bit about the history of environmental racism and environmental activism. And then we're going to go into some examples of environmental racism, and then we'll talk about how and why does it happen, and then how we can move towards an environmental justice framework. And now we're going to start off with some introductions. So my name is Leslie. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm a public health and ethnic studies major, and I am one of the outreach and engagement interns here at the Cross-Cultural Center, as well as a social justice educator.
Hi, my name is Salema Villa. I go by the gender pronoun she, her, hers. I am a public health major, and I am one of the other outreach and engagement interns and a social justice educator.
Hello, everyone. My name is Brendan Nahera, pronouns he, him, his. I'm an ethnic studies and history double major, and I'm the affiliates and leadership intern at the Cross-Cultural Center, as well as a social justice educator. So moving on with our presentation, we're first going to be talking about some important key terms that we would like you to keep in mind that we're going to mention throughout the presentation. So starting off, we wanted to define what environmental racism is, and the definition of that is a form of systemic racism whereby communities of color are disproportionately burdened with health hazards through policies and practices that force them to live in proximity to sources of toxic waste. When we talk about toxic waste, this includes sewage works, mines, landfills, power stations, major roads, and emitters of airborne particulate matter. As a result, these communities suffer greater rates of health problems attendant on hazardous pollutants. And if you could look at the image on the right-hand side, I think it does a good job at encompassing the process of what environmental racism is, with showing that communities of color tend to be people who are next to a lot of these toxic waste that can intentionally harm communities of color. And next, one of the big components that we're going to talk about as well is the definition of environmental justice and environmental activism. So when we talk about environmental justice, it is a social movement to address the unfair exposure of poor and marginalized communities to harms associated with resource extraction, hazardous waste, and other land uses. This is important to note because while environmental racism is one of the things that is a direct example of harm that can be done to communities of color, environmental justice is that direct combatant to environmental racism. So we're gonna go over the history of activism and as well as the history of racism, but it's also, when we talk about the history, which is something that we'll cover a lot in the presentation later, is also to highlight that there's people that are still doing great work today and fighting against environmental racism. So there are many organizations like the Indigenous Environmental Network, the Black Millennials for Flint, the Center on Race, Poverty, and the Environment, and the Nuestra Tierra Conservation Project, and many, many more organizations who are doing great work to fight back against environmental racism. Another key term that I wanted to go over was the global north and south, because this is very important when we talk about, say, when we mention international examples, but also in terms of just talking about the history of environmental racism. So when we talk about the global north and south, the global north represents the economically developed societies of Europe, North America, Australia, Israel, South Africa, amongst others. And the global south represents the economically considered backward countries of Africa, India, China, Brazil, Mexico, amongst others. Again, this is something to keep in mind when we talk about we're going to mention some international examples and also mention this during the history of environmental racism. And also, one of the last key terms I wanted to define is that of climate change. Climate change is a change in global or regional climate patterns, and particularly a change apparent from the mid to late 20th century onwards, and attributed largely to the increased levels of atmospheric carbon dioxide produced by the use of fossil fuels. So before we get into the history and I throw a lot of information at y'all, I wanted to just open it up to discussion questions. And here are some discussion questions that I wanted to ask y'all before we start our presentation. So what do you know about environmental racism / activism? And have you seen any examples of environmental racism in or around your community? Or have you heard of any examples of environmental racism? Don't forget to set chat to all panelists and attendees, and you can feel free to drop those down below. I really wanted to put this question in just because I was scrolling through Instagram one day and I saw like an interesting article that was like, why does LA smell so bad? And I was like, you know, it's funny, like being from Los Angeles, I always have to, there's certain areas where you drive around where you're like, I always tell my family, roll your window up, like put it up before we even get there. And it's funny that I didn't realize this until this presentation, but that is actually a direct example of environmental racism in our communities. If anyone's from Los Angeles in the area, if you know Southeast Los Angeles and you know Farmer John, you know that a lot of that area on Vernon and all the industrial places, it smells really, really bad. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that there's a lot of meat packaging things and a lot of places where they burn garbage without considering that odor and without considering the harm that it might do to people around that area, which is something that I never realized, but something that I made that connection to when looking at that. I saw the chat. I saw someone from the chat right now. Sorry, just that's also where I grew up there, so definitely understand that. But yeah, no, feel free to drop any examples that you know of in the chat, and you can feel free to share as we go on with the presentation. So now we're going to get started in talking about the history of environmental racism and activism. But before we get started, one of the things that we wanted to introduce in the next slide is a quick video, a quick 3-minute video that sums up what environmental racism is and some current world examples of what it is. This video is a YouTube video by AJ Plus, so you can feel free to look into it a little bit more after, but we're going to play the 3-minute video now.
When we think of racial injustice, we think police brutality or the criminal justice system. But what about our air and water? Environmental racism. It's about policies and practices that discriminate against communities of color by making them live near landfills, sewage plants, and other polluting facilities. And while poverty has a lot to do with it, the leading environmental justice expert told me this.
Racism trumps class. Even middle-income African Americans are more likely to live in more polluted neighborhoods.
In fact, one study found that Black Americans making $50,000 to $60,000 a year are more likely to live in polluted neighborhoods than white Americans who make just $10,000 a year. Flint, Michigan is a textbook case of environmental racism. It's where 100,000 residents have been poisoned with toxic water contaminated by high levels of lead. Why? Because the state was trying to save a buck. Flint is around 57% Black, with 40% of its population living in poverty. Residents protested the dirty water for over a year, but were ignored. And that's how environmental racism plays out. Minority communities have much less political clout, so regulators can and often do ignore them. And not far from Flint is Detroit, where 83% of the population is Black. It's home to the most polluted zip code in Michigan.
Zip code is the most powerful predictor of health. And all communities and all the zip codes are not created equal.
Southwest Detroit is surrounded by a lot of industry like salt mining, steel production, tar sands oil refining, and coal burning. And that's meant that 1.6 million pounds of chemicals enter that community yearly. Not coincidentally, Wayne County, where Detroit is, has the highest number of children's asthma cases in the state. But look, environmental racism isn't just a Michigan story, it's an American story. Take, for example, Louisiana's Cancer Alley, an 85-mile stretch along the Mississippi River. It's known for its over 200 petrochemical plants and a high rate of cancer, mainly among Black residents. So, is there anyone protecting folks from environmental racism? Well, there's supposed to be. The Environmental Protection Agency has a special department called the Office of Civil Rights, but in its 22-year history, the office has never formally found a single case of discrimination. In fact, more than 90% of communities that make complaints find them rejected or dismissed. On top of that, The Guardian newspaper recently revealed that U.S. authorities across the country are deliberately distorting water tests in cities like Detroit and Philadelphia to minimize the reported amount of lead in the water. Environmental racism, while not always the most visible form, is also widespread. So, when is enough enough?
So yeah, I really like that video because I think it encompasses a lot of what we're going to talk about later in the presentation, but also it's a great segue to now go over the history of environmental racism and activism. So environmental racism and climate change can be traced all the way back to the Industrial Revolution, believe it or not. Studies have shown that in some regions, climate change has begun as early as the 1830s. And that's a very, very long time for an issue that is still affecting us to this day. Not only did the mass consumption of coal contribute to the very first emissions of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, the Industrial Revolution created the idea of the developed country. With countries that have gone through an industrial revolution becoming developed, those who have not gone through that have become undeveloping countries. And then this leads us into the contemporary disparities between the global north and the global south, which I mentioned in our key terms. In the global south, where some nations still largely rely on agricultural exports to support their economies, the impact of environmental racism and climate change is crippling. If you look to the right-hand side on the image, this is a great visualizer of what people consider the global north and the global south. As you can see, with the north being dubbed the rich north and the south being dubbed the poor south. But the origin of the environmental justice movement can actually be traced back to the civil rights movement of the 1960s, as well as the environmental movement of the 1960s and 1970s. The fight for environmental justice actually took off in 1982 in something that the video mentioned. We're going to go into a little bit more depth when talking about what we can do to move towards environmental justice. But one of the first primary examples of environmental justice took off in 1982 when protests erupted in Warren County. So when we talk about Warren County, that was talking about Warren County is a place located in North Carolina, and it's predominantly a Black community. And the protests erupted over a plan to place a hazardous waste landfill in their community. The Environmental Protection Agency investigated 3 similar landfills in southern states like South Carolina and Alabama, and what they found was the fact that a lot of these places where they plan to put waste, or a lot of where these wasteful toxics are being found, predominantly have to be in low-income communities, not only low-income communities, but predominantly in Black communities. And this is where we see the first kind of real example of environmental activism kicking off. The photo on the right-hand side is actually an image from the first protests that happened in Warren County. I really thought I wanted to share that photo because I think it's empowering to show that, you know, this has been a fight that's been going on for a while, especially here within the States. So the term environmental racism grew out of this grassroots activism. In 1982, Dr. Benjamin Chavez, person pictured here on the right-hand side, coined the term in response to an incident in Warren County. Dr. Benjamin Chavez, who was actually the then director of the United Church of Christ Commission of Racial Justice, also known as the CRJ. Chavez and others, including the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC, Joseph Lowry, and the Congressional Black Caucus, CBC, member Walter Fauntroy, participated in a month-long protest against the sitting of a chemical landfill in Warren County. Again, we're going to go a little bit more into depth to this a little bit later, but just wanting to shed about how the term environmental racism and everything that led up to it actually stem back to what was happening in Warren County. So while the initial month-long protest was unsuccessful, the CRJ put together a report titled Toxic Waste and Race in the United States, a national report on the racial and socioeconomic characteristics of communities with hazardous waste sites. And this was the first report of its kind, and that found that most hazardous waste sites were most likely to be located in minority communities. This is a screenshot that I took of the report. This is something that has been updated more and more, but the original one, the first ever of its kind to do like a large study on this, happened in 1987, which is pretty interesting considering that, again, this is an issue that is continuing to this day, and it's something that people are continuing to study. And also something to note, going back to the video, that they mentioned that there's a branch of people who actually are supposed to be taking on these cases. It actually stems back to activism that came back from the people fighting for this. And in 1990, the Congressional Black Caucus and a bipartisan coalition of academic, social scientists, and political activists met with the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, officials to discuss the heightened environmental risks for minority and low-income populations. Because of these conversations, a lot of these task force started to form and started to mobilize. But again, as the video said, sometimes there isn't a lot being done with the task force that are being formed, which is a little bit hard to see, especially with, again, these issues are continuous. And as I've seen in the chat with a lot of the examples, a lot of y'all know, and a lot of y'all have shared like some examples that you have seen firsthand of environmental racism. But while there are modern examples, there are also historic examples that I wanted to share of environmental racism. The first one going back to the North River sewage treatment plant in New York. So this was one of the first examples that I wanted to cover because I think it kind of, again, encompasses a lot of the movements that were happening in the late 70s, early 80s in regards to the environmental justice movement. So in 1885, the North River sewage treatment plant, which is the NRSTP, was constructed in West Harlem. This was this move in general, when they built the plants in West Harlem, caught a lot of people off guard because it was actually going to be located in far away from the communities. It was actually going to be in a more wealthier middle class area of New York. And because people didn't want it there and they argued over it, they ended up moving it to West Harlem without any consideration of the community whatsoever. So in addition to the offensive smell, after the opening of the NRSTP, many residents complained of itchy eyes, shortness of breath, and other symptoms often related to asthma and other respiratory ailments because of the putrid and horrible smell that was coming out of the plant. And this is considering that, again, without any consideration, they put the plants in a predominantly Black community, and it was affecting a lot of the residents without any consideration for what the community was dealing with. The problem and smell was addressed, or getting a little bit ahead of myself. So Community Board 9 and We Act, the West Harlem Environmental Action, became active lobbyists for control of the plant. These groups continued to put pressure on the administration, and in 1991, an investigation was finally conducted. The investigation was finally conducted because the problem of the smell was the problem of the smell was one of the big things that people were addressing. And finally, once the investigation happened, money was allocated to address the problems that were found. And believe it or not, this is another photo of this protest happening back in 1985. And it's very interesting that the community ended up taking these people to court and sued them because of everything that was happening. So this is just one example of some of the things that environmental racism does to communities. And it's not the only example, as we can go into the next one. And I think this was one of the more interesting ones, considering that this has to do with the atomic bomb and the Manhattan Project that the US was developing way back when in World War II. So in New Mexico, Project Y is a historic example of what little mind can be thought to use, or what little thought can go into, especially with people and the communities that people are living in. When it came to the Manhattan Project and the creation of the atomic bomb, they needed to test the atomic bomb and what they were doing for. So they ended up developing Project Y, and they decided to move a lot of the residents located in New Mexico. They basically told them to pack your things and go, because we're going to be doing tests here. And so the communities in New Mexico were forcibly removed to test the atomic bomb and were not compensated at all for their things, despite the government telling them to leave and it being against the law for them to not get some form of compensation. Compensation only came 60 years later, after, again, people took this to court and fought it. So, and I wanted to give a quote over something to give a little bit more context of why everything that was happening in New Mexico was why everything that was happening in New Mexico was very sad to see, considering the fact that despite them testing the atomic bomb and everything that was happening, a few years later, they developed an act in New Mexico saying that, okay, we're going to be looking into these environmental racism things. We're going to be looking into these horrible things that have been happening in the community. And they decided to call these like Superfund sites. They had to find sites that were hazardous, and then they would go in and work a case on it. And this was an interesting quote that I wanted to share, because currently there are 21 Superfund sites in New Mexico on EPA's national priorities list. Keep in mind, there's 21 of them in New Mexico that are hazardous to the community and the people around them, including 3 in Albuquerque. And several of the New Mexico Superfund sites are a direct result of the nuclear legacy in New Mexico, including the uranium mining. The photos for this, by the way, are very, very like shocking. I mean, that's a direct photo of the mushroom cloud that formed in New Mexico when they were testing the atomic bomb. And one can only imagine of the hazardous things that are around, especially because of uranium and all the nuclear radiation that is around New Mexico. So it's, again, while this is something that happened during the creation of World War II, this is still something that is plaguing New Mexico to this day. And this is just one example, or these were just 2 examples of many different historical acts of environmental racism. So now, after sharing all that information, I know that there was a lot. I know that I tossed a lot at you. I wanted to get your reaction on what you thought of this history. Did you know about any of this history surrounding environmental racism and activism? Or also, is there any part of the history that we missed that you know of? I know that this was like a very condensed information thrown at you, but like if you have any insight, I would love to hear it, and you can set chat to everyone to make sure that we get your notes. I appreciate everyone already sending thoughts as we're going with the presentation. Yeah, no, I share that sentiment. I genuinely also thought it was recent. And no, it's been going back to the Industrial Revolution and the plague of in the big boom of wanting to industrialize the nation. We've also been polluting and harming the environment in general, but also communities of color especially get harmed during that process. But yeah, if you have any more thoughts or anything you'd like to share, you can feel free to drop it in the chat as we continue with the presentation. But I appreciate seeing everyone share everything right now.
Thank you all for sharing your thoughts. I know Brandon just went over a couple examples, though these were more historic. We'll now move into some more recent examples and some more contemporary examples that we've been seeing today. The first one being the Dakota Access Pipeline. So the Dakota Access Pipeline is a pipeline that transports crude oil from North Dakota to Illinois, and it crosses through various communities and tribal lands. The pipeline was built under Lake Oahe, which is the Standing Rock Sioux's main water source. And building this pipeline through Lake Oahe would pose a serious risk to not only the survival of the land, but the survival of the people as well, and the natural resources in this area. This pipeline at any moment could spill or jeopardize the health and the water supply of the Standing Rock Sioux's. And the construction of the pipe alone already displaced so many communities and displaced various wildlife that was inhabiting that area. And this again all has the potential to pose a serious health risk to this community. And it's interesting because there was actually an alternative option that was proposed before they built it through the main water source of the Standing Rock Sioux's. So if you guide your eyes here to the bottom right, the dotted line shows the earlier proposed route for this pipeline. And so if you notice, this pipeline was actually originally planned to be built through the Mississippi River, which is closer to the capital of North Dakota, which is Bismarck. However, the population of Bismarck was very against this for the same reasons that the Standing Rock Sioux was against it, because in building the pipeline through the Mississippi River, that would have jeopardized the capital's water source. And the government took their concerns more into consideration, and instead they decided to build it through the Standing Rock Sioux's water source. So while we can see that both their concerns were very valid, we also see the dynamics of power that were at play and how certain people, and in this case, the Standing Rock Sioux's, were overlooked and seen as disposable as the Dakota Access Pipeline was continued to be built through their land. I know that the video that we watched earlier mentioned Flint, Michigan more in depth, but I wanted to go over it again. So Flint, Michigan, this situation is where the state of Michigan decided to switch its drinking water supply from Detroit's system to the Flint River instead, in an attempt to save money. And what this did is this actually led to 6,000 to 12,000 children to be exposed to lead and tap water from the years 2014 through 2016. And this is because when they made the switch in water sources, they didn't properly test the water supply to test if it was free of contaminants and had proper levels that were safe for the population to be exposed to. And keeping in mind, most of the population in Flint is Black, 56% of the population is Black. So it almost seems like this was an intentional choice. And to this day, not all Flint residents have access to clean and lead-free tap water. So they are still bearing the brunt of these consequences. To bring it back more locally, I wanted to talk about Barrio Logan in San Diego. So if y'all aren't familiar with Barrio Logan is a community in San Diego who has experienced a large amount of encroachment of industries and factories in residential areas. Not only that, but the construction of the freeways has introduced many pollutants into the air of the residents of this community. This began in 1963 with the construction of the Interstate 5 that was built over Logan Heights, and then again in 1967 with the construction of the Coronado Bridge. And these freeways introduced large amounts of pollutants into these communities, because not only were they exposed to the factories and the industries alongside the residential areas, but they were also introduced to the freeways where there's large amounts of cars passing over all the time. And on top of that, Barrio Logan is also placed near the naval site where there are a lot of ships coming in and out. So they have pollution coming in from at least 3 different types of areas. And so these high pollutants make it very likely that these residents will be susceptible to asthma and other respiratory illnesses. And it's important to note that the population who resides here is largely Latinx and other folks of color, and as well as immigrant communities. And to bring this back more globally, we wanted to talk a little bit about the palm oil industry in Indonesia. So the palm oil, if y'all are not familiar, is a type of oil that is used in various products, ranging from beauty products like lipsticks, to shampoos, to foods, to even ice creams. And because of its multi-purpose, there has been a really large demand for it. And majority of its production comes from Indonesia. So a lot of companies decided to buy plots of land there and plant more palm oil trees. But in order to make space for the growth, they had to burn down forests. And they did not take into consideration the indigenous populations that were living in these forests and who were getting their needs from this forest, such as water and food and shelter as well. And so when they burned down these forests, this introduced smoke and fumes into the people who were residing here. And this actually resulted in 100,000 Indonesians having died due to smoke inhalation from the burning of the land to make way for even more plantations. And there has been a perpetual disregard for the concerns of indigenous communities, as we saw even with the Dakota Access Pipeline, and here bringing it back to Indonesia. And many communities living in these lands have spoken out about these injustices and about their concerns with what is happening. However, they've been overlooked because their lands are still seen as profitable. So it doesn't matter to many companies. And again, the global demand for the interest in palm oil businesses drives these injustices.
So moving on to how and why it happens, we're going to talk about how environmental racism happens and who specifically and the impacts of it. So first, I want to talk about the origin of environmental racism. So the first well-documented evidence of environmental racism was by sociologist Robert Bouliard, who linked environmental hazards disproportionately affected communities of color across the United States, specifically communities of color such as Black and Latinx. He also stated that government officials or other individuals in positions of power, such as CEOs, will purposely dump their environmental hazards or create dump sites in the backyards of low income and minority communities because they themselves do not want to deal with the pollution or have it in their backyard. And they specifically target these communities because they know they cannot defend themselves in court or have any laws and policies in place to protect them. So one big example of this recently was California Waste Management Board. They were trying to find a place where to put their toxic waste incinerators, and a review came out that they were trying to find a community that was specifically low income, Catholic, and mainly people who cannot defend themselves in court. And this translated to a Latinx neighborhood. And they ended up picking the Central Valley of where to put their toxic waste incinerators. However, since the report came out, they were able to defend themselves and not have them in their backyard. But this is one example of many victims of environmental racism, and not all can defend themselves like this community did. Also, other contributing factors that we just briefly touched upon were affordable land. So if the land is affordable in the community of a low income or minority community, a company can buy it out to put their waste hazards in there. Moreover, lack of political power to fight corporations and lack of policies go hand in hand with one another. So as previously talked about, if a community lacks any political laws or environmental laws in place to protect them from having environmental hazards or pollution in their backyard, they cannot do anything about it and would have to deal with it. Moreover, poverty. So low-income communities are most disproportionately affected. So this is nothing that they can change about themselves, and big corporations will take advantage of this. And another factor that contributes to environmental racism is redlining. Some of you may have already heard this term, but I'm going to redefine it. Redlining is a discriminatory practice in which services are withheld from potential customers who reside in neighborhoods classified as hazardous to invest in. So with redlining, communities of low income, minority, or Black and Latinx are specifically cut out from receiving resources from the city. So food, health, recreational resources. And since they are cut out, they are also looked down upon. And this gives a reason to government officials or to people in positions of power, such as corporations, to specifically place their dump sites or hazardous waste in their areas because they know they cannot defend themselves. And this practice has contributed to environmental racism greatly because while people once avoided these neighborhoods, they have become the grounds for environmental hazard. And next, I want to focus on who is primarily affected. So we already briefly touched upon it, but low-income communities and minority communities are disproportionately affected, mainly Black and Brown communities. And I specifically want to focus on air pollution in these communities. So air pollution is not equally distributed in the US. Low socioeconomic communities and minority communities, such as Black and Brown communities, are disproportionately affected. And if you were to turn your attention to the right side of the screen to the graph, this is an example of how bad air pollution is for these communities specifically. So this graph illustrates the average person's contribution and exposure to air pollution by race/ethnicity. So on the first graph, we have Black, second Hispanic, and third white. The red line represents exposure to air pollution and the blue line represents contribution to air pollution. So we can see with the Black community, they have the lowest contribution, yet the highest exposure. And the same pattern is repeated for the Hispanic community. They also have one of the second lowest contribution, yet the highest exposure. Yet if we were to look at their white counterparts, they have the highest contribution, yet the lowest exposure. So here we can see a clear contrast of communities of color being disproportionately affected and having no choice to it. And while the white communities get to pollute more, yet they have no high negative health outcomes in comparison to Black and Hispanic. And Black, Hispanic, and Hispanic community disproportionately also have more negative health outcomes because of this. They're likelier to experience asthma, respiratory diseases, and heart disease. And to further illustrate this situation, another fact about air pollution in the United States is that Black residents absorb 1.5 more air pollution in comparison to white communities who get a boost and exposed to 17 less produced air pollution. So you can see here, there is a clear health disparity and contrast and more negative health outcomes for the communities of color. And next, I want to magnify the situation and explore it further with climate change impacts. So in the news, we've all probably seen the impacts of climate change, but I want to explore it specifically in communities of color. So as climate change effects become more visible in the US, it has also become clear that those effects are disproportionately hitting minority communities. And I specifically want to illustrate the situation with Hurricane Katrina first. So in New Orleans, 75% of residents in badly flooded areas were Black. And when recovery aid came to these communities, it was mainly given to their white and wealthy counterparts in comparison to the poor or minority ones who really needed the resources. Moreover, this has become a common pattern in disasters where minority communities, low income, or people of color do not receive the resources they need in disasters. Instead, they are ignored for their white and wealthy counterparts to receive them. Another example is with heat and temperatures. So temperatures in formerly redlined areas that we just talked about can have temperature over 10 degrees Fahrenheit hotter than other neighborhoods in the same city. They also lack tree covers and spaces to take cover in from the heat. Moreover, these communities also have more pavement and concrete, which just makes the situation even hotter. I know for myself, this was my hometown in Sun Valley, where we don't have much green spaces and we're mainly just concrete and pavement. We're also next to one of the oldest landfills in Los Angeles. So we are surrounded by pollution and heat. And moreover, communities who are in places that are likely to be hotter do not have proper air conditioning because these houses were built a while ago and don't properly support these types of new technologies. To illustrate the situation a bit more, I want to turn your attention to the graph on the right side of the screen talking about this inequality cycle. So with multidimensional inequality, this talks about the low income, minority, and people of color who are disproportionately affected and have less resources because it is out of their control and they cannot do anything about it. But in comparison, if you move onto the next part of the graph, you see that their white counterparts who are wealthier receive more resources and get to take up the resources even though they don't need them. And this leads to less public resources for the communities to use. And as a result, there are more negative health outcomes for these communities and more health disparities as a result, sadly. And now I want to talk about who contributes to this, because you might have started thinking about that a little after hearing these previous slides. So the nonprofit As You Sow collected and analyzed data from 500 companies showing their environmental impact on communities of colors, and companies who had low scores were largely attributed to the sector's ongoing legacy of polluting non-white communities. And the first company I want to focus on is ExxonMobil. They were penalized for their activities in Beaumont, Texas, where one of its crude oil refineries had regularly been in non-compliance with the Clean Air Act, and they had been spewing toxic carcinogens into majority Black neighborhoods, leading them to receive a score of negative 23%, which was one of the lowest scores on the list too. Other companies who were guilty of this were O'Reilly and Nuker. I also want to highlight some other major companies that you may be familiar with that are contributing to the pollution. So if you turn your attention to the right side of the screen, there is a simple graph talking about the worst plastic polluters in 2020. And you may see that the first one is Coca-Cola, a company that we are all familiar with. Other ones include Nestle and P&G. So we may not know it, but these companies are contributing largely to pollution and to polluting in communities of color. Throughout these past slides, you may have also thought about if any companies that you may favor or just came to your head contribute to environmental racism and pollution. We have a calculator, well, a website that can tell you about it and calculate for it to see what their score is. And I will drop that into the chat for y'all. So if you're interested in looking at a company, you can check out this website. And if you also thought about your own carbon footprint, or if you may be contributing to pollution, there's also a carbon footprint calculator for y'all to check out too, which I will drop in the chat. Should only take a couple minutes, but it's also really interesting to see what you may be doing unknowingly. And I will give y'all some time to see what your carbon footprint is. I remember when I did it, I was a vegetarian. I was living at home with my parents because of quarantine. I did not have a car. I was not going out. So I thought my footprint was going to be pretty low. It was not. So that was a shock to me. So I'm interested in seeing what my carbon footprint is now too. So if you're comfortable with sharing, please drop it into the chat.
In the interest of time, we are going to move on, but feel free to check out the link, do it on your own time, and share with us if you did end up doing it right now. So now we're going to talk about moving towards an environmental justice framework. So just to recap, environmental justice is the idea that all communities, regardless of color or race, should be treated fairly when it comes to the development, implementation, and enforcement of public health and environmental laws, regulations, and policies. And as Brandon mentioned earlier, the civil rights movement was very significant to launching the environmental justice movement, as it paved the way for community organizing and large actions. And again, as Brandon mentioned, Warren County in North Carolina in 1982 played a really formative role in launching the environmental justice movement. To recap, Warren County was a predominantly Black community that was chosen to host a hazardous waste spill. The state of North Carolina decided to move contaminated PCB into this community. And PCB, the health effects that can come from being exposed to PCB are very serious, and some can even be cancerous. So being exposed to this was very detrimental to this community, and they knew it was detrimental. So that's why they fought hard to remove it. And this again sparked a large wave of protests against this action, as the folks of this community and other allies realized that this was just an extension of the racism that they were already encountering for decades. Unfortunately, the community lost this fight, and the state went ahead with its plan to put the soil in Warren County. And even though they lost, the controversy that came from this movement surrounding all these actions showed others across the nation that environmental injustices disproportionately impacts low-income Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So as Suleyman went over earlier, companies contribute a lot to climate change. In fact, 70% of the world's greenhouse gases have been emitted by only 100 companies. So while yes, we as individuals also contribute to climate change, we are not the main contributors. Unfortunately, those who bear the brunt of climate change, such as natural disasters, wildfires, droughts, pollutions, etc., are not the ones who contribute to it the most. Many of us have to face the consequences that result from corporate greed. And I found this cartoon to be particularly illuminating on what we just talked about. So if you turn your attention to the right, there's a little cartoon. It says the rich get richer and the poor get their byproducts. So taking a look back at all the examples that we've mentioned, such as Flint, Dakota Access Pipeline, palm oil, Warren County, what was it that all these populations had in common? And it was that they were all going up against rich entities that held more power, and they were unfortunately left to suffer the consequences of their actions. And this is why we have to look beyond the conservation of only the environment, because much of the early activism that revolved around the environment was about conserving the land. But even when they did talk about conserving the land, they did not take into account the native populations who were already conserving the land. And sometimes efforts to conserve land, such as creating national parks, actually ended up displacing a lot of indigenous communities. So it's really important to look at environmental racism as a result of the ongoing forced dispossession of indigenous people from their land, and center race both in the discussions and the solutions. So from an indigenous perspective, environmental injustices are a symptom of ongoing colonialism and capitalism, as it dispossesses the land from indigenous folks, and they are also subject to continuous exploitation of their natural resources. And this can be seen again in the example of the palm oil industry that we mentioned earlier. Indigenous people bear the brunt of the consequences of climate change, again, drawing back to the example of the oil pipelines disrupting the water sources. Indigenous people have been at the forefront in the fight for environmental justice for decades. They have been the stewards of the land for years, and this is why we need to look beyond just the conservation of the environment, because much of the early activism that revolved around this, again, was like talking about conserving the environment, but not really taking into account the indigenous voices and the indigenous perspectives that were happening. And so a lot of the time, because indigenous perspectives bring attention to the root issues, such as colonialism, instead of focusing on simply the conservation, a lot of their activism and a lot of their actions often go unnoticed. So ignoring the deep-rooted historical forces that cause environmental injustices further perpetuates even more environmental injustices. And in order to achieve environmental justice, we must center indigenous voices. Indigenous environmental justice recognizes the agency of non-humans. So for example, seeing water as a living entity, and this means treating it with respect as opposed to exploiting it, and seeing it as an opportunity to create further profit. So in order to enact change, we must consider doing it at all levels, for example, institutional, local, and individual, while also prioritizing changing our relationship between us and the land. So again, no longer treating it as a commodity and as something that we can exploit to make profit off of, but instead respecting it and seeing it, essentially, yeah, just bettering the relationship between both of us. And this leads me to ask this discussion question. Have you ever had an experience where you were present and in tune with the environment? For me, I typically usually have these experiences when I'm in my parents' pueblo in Oaxaca, as it is mainly surrounded by greenery, and there's also like little to no access to Wi-Fi or technology. So there's like no choice but for me to kind of get in tune with the environment. And it's in these moments that I guess really appreciate the environment for what it gives, and the air, the water, and just I ground myself and really consider my relationship with the environment and how the environment provides us our necessities. And I think this is something that I guess we should think of when we are trying to change our relationship with the environment. And again, work towards an environmental justice movement. But yeah, feel free to drop any experiences y'all may have had in the chat. And now we're going to move on to some resources. So if you want to learn more about environmental racism, feel free to check out these links on the right, on the left-hand side. These links will be in this QR code that I have on the bottom left. So if you want to check out the resources that I have listed here on this slide and the resources that we use throughout this presentation, feel free to scan this QR code. And I also wanted to plug in some organizations in San Diego that have been working to fight for environmental justice and address these inequities that are happening locally here. One of them being the Environmental Health Coalition, another being more local to UCSD, the Student Sustainability Collective at UCSD, and another organization here in San Diego called San Diego 350. And all of these revolve around addressing inequities in the environmental justice movement and really trying to bridge those gaps. Thank you. That leads us to our last slide. Thank you all for coming and showing up and engaging. If y'all have any questions, you can check out our website at cccenter.ucsd.edu or emailing us at cccenter@ucsd.edu.